The dust of the town was a fine, pale powder that settled on everything, a shroud for things living and dead. It coated the brim of Elias's hat and settled in the creases of his knuckles, which were cracked and dry like old leather. He stood by the general store, a figure carved from the unyielding landscape itself, his stillness a stark contrast to the nervous energy of the town. His gaze, distant and heavy, carried the weight of empty rooms and silent winters. He was a man who had forgotten the sound of his own voice in conversation, speaking mostly to his horse and the unblinking sky. He needed help. The ranch, his father's and his father's before that, was a sprawling, lonely thing that demanded more than one pair of hands could give. The dust wasn't just outside. It had crept into the house, a film over the memory of his wife, Sarah. It muted the color of the quilt she had made, settled on the rocking chair that no longer moved. He needed someone to beat it back, to scrub the floors and wash the linens, to fight the slow decay that had set in the day he buried her. He saw the woman then. She stood near the livery, separate from the gossiping knots of townswomen. She was thin as a fence rail that had seen too many seasons. Her dress was a faded calico, patched at the elbows and frayed at the hem. She did not look at anyone, her focus fixed on a loose board in the walkway, as if it held the answer to a question no one had bothered to ask. There was a stillness about her, too, but it was not the stillness of a mountain. It was the stillness of a cornered animal, conserving every last flicker of energy. He watched her for a long time. People flowed around her like a river around a stone. They saw her, he knew, but they did not see her. They saw poverty. They saw a problem to be avoided. Elias saw the set of her jaw, a line of quiet defiance against the slump of her shoulders. He saw the way her hands were clenched at her sides, not in anger, but as if holding on to something vital that might otherwise be swept away by the wind. He walked over. His boots made a soft, heavy sound on the wooden planks. She didn't look up until his shadow fell over her. When she did, her eyes were the color of a winter sky just before the snow, clouded and guarded. They held no expectation. "You looking for work?" His voice was rough, like stones grinding together, a sound unused to forming questions. She gave a single, short nod. Her gaze dropped back to the worn board. "I need a woman for cleaning. Cooking," he stated it like a fact of the land, like announcing a coming frost. "My place is a day's ride west. Pay is fair." She hesitated. He could feel the turning of gears behind her eyes, the weighing of one unknown against another. The town offered her nothing but averted glances. He offered a day's ride into a bigger silence. "I'll take it," she said. Her voice was thin, but it was steady. It was the first sound he had heard from her, a small thing against the vastness of the prairie. "Be ready at sunup," he said, and turned away. The transaction was complete. He did not ask her name. He did not offer his. They were employer and employee, a contract drawn in the dust between them. She was there the next morning as the sun bled a pale orange across the horizon. She had a single, small bundle tied with twine. He nodded, gesturing with his head toward the buckboard wagon. She climbed up without a word, settling herself on the hard plank seat, her back ramrod straight. The journey was a silent one, broken only by the creak of the wagon wheels and the low sigh of the wind. Dust lifted behind them like the ghosts of all the words they did not speak. The ranch was just as he had left it, a collection of weathered gray buildings hunkered down against the endless expanse of sky. The house, the barn, the corrals. They all looked tired, worn down by the constant wind. He pulled the wagon to a halt before the house. "Barn has a clean stall," he said, not looking at her. It was an arrangement he had made with hired men before. A place to sleep, dry and out of the wind. Hay is fresh. House is there. Work starts after you're settled. She slid down from the wagon before he could offer a hand he had no intention of offering anyway. She took her small bundle and walked toward the barn, her steps measured, her head held high. She did not look back. For a week, their lives fell into a strange, silent orbit. He would rise before dawn, find coffee already brewed and a slab of bacon left for him on the stove. He would work the fence lines, his mind occupied with the familiar ache of labor, and return at dusk to find the floors swept, the scent of soap in the air, and a plate of food on the table. They ate at the same table, a vast ocean of polished wood between them, the silence broken only by the scrape of forks on tin plates. He would see her sometimes, a fleeting shape in a window, a ghost polishing the memory from his things. She was efficient, tireless, and as silent as the dust she fought. But there was something else. Furtiveness. He would find scraps of bread missing, more than a woman her size would eat. A heel of cheese gone from the larder. A bucket of milk that seemed to diminish faster than he drank it. He thought little of it at first. Perhaps the loneliness was making him miscount. One night, a storm rolled in. One of those sudden prairie squalls that turned the sky to bruised purple and threw rain like handfuls of gravel against the house. The wind howled, a living thing clawing at the windows. He was checking the latches when he heard it, a sound carried on a gust of wind from the direction of the barn. It was faint, almost lost in the storm's fury, but it was unmistakable. A child's cry. He froze, his hand on the cold iron of the door latch. He listened. The wind shrieked, mocking him. He told himself it was the wind, playing tricks. The wind could sound like anything. Could sound like a woman weeping. Could sound like a child's cry. He pulled on his coat, the oiled canvas stiff and cold. He lit a lantern, the flame a fragile, dancing thing, and stepped out into the tempest. The rain was a solid wall, plastering his hair to his skull in an instant. He leaned into the wind, his boots sinking into the mud, and made his way toward the barn. The big barn doors were barred from the inside, but the small side door was unlatched. He pushed it open. The familiar scent of hay and animals and old wood washed over him, thick and warm. The storm was a muffled roar out here. He held the lantern high. Its light cast long, dancing shadows. And then he saw them. In the far stall, the one he had told her was clean, she had made a nest. She had piled the hay high against the rough-hewn walls, and over it, she had spread her own thin blanket. She was crouched there, her body a shield against the drafts. And huddled behind her, their small faces pale in the flickering lantern light, were 4 children. The oldest, a boy of maybe 7, stared at him with wide, defiant eyes. Beside him, 2 smaller girls were burrowed into the hay, their faces streaked with sleep and dirt. And in the woman's arms, wrapped in what looked like a tattered shawl, was a baby, the source of the cry he had heard. It was whimpering softly now, a small, desolate sound. She looked up at him, and for the first time, the mask of stoic resignation was gone. In its place was a raw, primal fear. She clutched the baby tighter, her knuckles white. She didn't speak. She didn't plead. She simply waited for the verdict, her body braced for the blow. Elias stood there, the lantern light throwing his long shadow over them. The rain drummed on the roof. The wind moaned around the corners of the barn. He looked at the 4 small faces, blinking in the unfamiliar light. He looked at the woman, poised on the knife's edge of desperation. He saw the worn-out shoes lined up neatly by the hay. He saw a small, carved wooden horse, its paint all but gone, tucked into a fold of the blanket. He lowered the lantern. The shadows softened. He thought of his own 2 children, taken by the fever with their mother. He thought of the 2 small graves on the hill behind the house, their markers weathered and gray. He thought of the suffocating emptiness of the rooms, the silence that had become his only companion. He took a slow breath. The air was thick with the smell of rain and damp hay and fear. "The barn's too cold," he said. His voice was still rough, but the sharp edges had been worn away. "The roof leaks in the east corner." She stared at him, her eyes wide with incomprehension. She did not understand. He turned and walked back to the house, leaving the lantern on a post near the stall. Its steady glow was a silent promise. Inside, he went to the room that had been his son's. He opened the window a crack to air out the staleness. He pulled the dusty quilt from the small bed and laid a fresh log on the fire in the main room, coaxing the embers back to life. He set 4 small tin cups on the table and filled a pot with milk to warm on the stove. He did not go back to the barn. He waited. He sat in his chair by the fire, listening to the storm and the crackle of the flames. An hour passed, then another. He was beginning to think she would not come, that her fear was greater than her faith in his strange, unspoken offer. And then the door creaked open. She stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the stormy dark, the baby clutched to her chest. Behind her, clinging to her skirt, were the 3 other children, their eyes enormous in the firelight. They looked like a small, shipwrecked crew washed up on a foreign shore. She looked at him, a question in her eyes so profound it needed no words. He gestured with his head toward the warmth. "There's milk on the stove." She hesitated for a moment longer, then shepherded her children inside, closing the door softly behind them. The sound of the latch clicking into place shut out the storm. For the first time in 3 years, the house was full. The silence was broken not by the wind, but by the soft shuffling of small feet on the wooden floor. He led them to the small bedroom. It was sparse, but it was clean and warm. "This will do," he said, his words feeling large and clumsy in the small space. The woman, he still did not know her name, looked at the bed, then at her children. She nodded, a gesture so faint it was barely perceptible. She did not thank him. The gratitude was a palpable thing in the air, too large and fragile for words. That night, he gave them the room and he slept in his chair by the fire. He listened to the foreign sounds of his own house, the soft murmur of a mother's voice, the sigh of a child settling into a safe sleep. The house seemed to breathe again, its old, hollow lungs filling with a new and tentative life. The days that followed fell into a new routine, a delicate, unspoken choreography. The woman, whose name he learned was Lena when her oldest boy, Sam, called out to her, moved through the house with a quiet purpose. She was no longer just a cleaner. She was the silent governess of this new, fragile domesticity. The house, under her care, began to shed its skin of neglect. The windows were so clean the sunlight seemed new. The scent of baking bread replaced the smell of dust and sorrow. The children were like cautious field mice at first, scurrying from room to room, their voices hushed, their eyes darting toward him whenever he entered. There was Sam, the oldest, with his solemn gaze that seemed too old for his face. There were the twin girls, Elspeth and May, with hair the color of straw and identical patched dresses. And there was the baby, Anna, who spent her days swaddled in a blanket in a wooden crate Lena had placed by the hearth. Elias kept his distance. He worked his land from sunup to sundown, the familiar rhythms of the ranch a comfort to him. But he was aware of them, a constant presence at the edge of his senses. He would come in for his midday meal and find 4 small pairs of boots lined up by the door, caked in the same mud as his own. He would hear the faint sound of the girls singing a rhyming game in the yard, their voices thin and sweet like birdsong after a long winter. He did not speak to them, not directly, but the gestures began, small and careful as building a fire with damp wood. He found Sam trying to fix a broken wheel on a small wooden cart. The boy's brow was furrowed in concentration, his small hands struggling with the splintered axle. Elias watched him from the porch for a moment, then went to his workshop and returned. He knelt, not saying a word, and with a bit of whittling and a spot of grease, he fixed the wheel. He handed the cart back to the boy. Sam stared at the repaired toy, then up at Elias, a flicker of awe in his dark eyes. He whispered a thank you that was swallowed by the wind. Elias just nodded and walked away. One afternoon, he saw Lena standing on the small hill behind the house. She was standing before the 2 small graves, Sarah's and his sons and daughters. She was not praying. She was simply standing there, her hands clasped before her. After a moment, she knelt and began to pull the weeds that had grown thick around the simple wooden markers. She worked for a long time, her movements patient and methodical. When she was done, She went back to the house and returned with a jar of water and a handful of wild prairie flowers. She placed them between the two graves. Elias watched from the barn, a knot tightening in his chest. No one had tended those graves but him. No one had dared. He felt a strange mix of trespass and gratitude. It was as if she were not just cleaning his house, but tending to the untended gardens of his grief. The chill of autumn began to sharpen the air. The nights grew colder. He started leaving a larger pile of firewood on the porch each evening. He came home one day to find his favorite work shirt, the one with the tear in the sleeve, lying on his bed. The tear was gone, replaced by a line of neat, almost invisible stitches. He ran his calloused thumb over the mend. It was a small thing, a nothing thing, but it felt like an anchor. The children grew bolder. They would sometimes follow him at a distance as he did his chores, their curiosity winning out over their fear. May, the shyer of the twins, once offered him a rock she had found, a smooth, gray stone that fit perfectly in the palm of his hand. He took it without a word and put it in his pocket. He still had it. Section. The silence between him and Lena remained, but it was changing. It was no longer an empty, awkward thing. It was becoming a shared space, a language of its own. It was in the way he left the last piece of her apple pie for her, and the way she left the coffee pot on the warm part of the stove for when he came in from the cold. It was in the way their eyes would sometimes meet across the dinner table, a fleeting moment of understanding before they both looked away. One night, a scream tore through the quiet of the house. It was Sam. Elias was out of his chair before he was fully awake, his heart pounding. He met Lena in the hallway. Her face was a stark white mask in the moonlight slanting through the window. "A nightmare," she whispered, and hurried into the children's room. Elias stood at the door. He could hear her soft, murmuring voice, trying to soothe the boy, but Sam's sobs continued, panicked and raw. Elias stepped into the room. Lena was stroking the boy's hair, but he was thrashing, caught in the grips of a terror Elias knew all too well. He walked to the bed and sat on the edge. He didn't touch the boy. He just sat there, a solid, unmoving presence in the dim light. "It's just a dream, son," he said, his voice low and steady. "The sun will be up soon. The dreams can't stay in the daylight." Sam's sobs slowly subsided into shuddering breaths. He peeked at Elias from under the quilt. His eyes were wide and wet. "He was coming back," the boy whispered. "He was gonna take us." Lena's hand froze on her son's head. A cold dread seeped into the room. Elias looked at her. Her face was unreadable, but he could feel the tremor that ran through her. He kept his voice even. "No one's coming here. I told you. This place is safe." He looked back at Sam. "You're safe here." He sat with him until the boy's breathing evened out into sleep. Lena never moved, a statue by the bedside. When he was sure Sam was asleep, Elias stood up and walked back to the main room. He stoked the fire, the flames leaping up to lick at the fresh log. He sat in his chair and stared into the blaze. A few minutes later, Lena appeared in the doorway. She didn't speak, just came and sat on the braided rug before the hearth, wrapping her arms around her knees. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sounds the pop and hiss of the fire. The house was quiet again, but the nightmare lingered in the air between them. "You had children," she said, her voice so soft he barely heard it. It was not a question. He didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on the fire. "A boy and a girl. With my Sarah." He felt her gaze on him, but he couldn't meet it. He hadn't spoken their names aloud to another living soul in 3 years. Saying them felt like tearing open a wound he had thought long scarred over. "He was my husband," she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "Sam's father. The girl's too. Not Anna's." She paused. "He wasn't a kind man. When he drank, he was less kind. He said we were his property, like a horse or a chair. Said he could do what he liked. The fire only changes everything if something new is waiting in the ash." Elias felt the old, cold grief in his chest shift, making room for a different kind of ache. It was the ache of anger, a clean, hot anger he hadn't felt in a long time. "He died," she continued, her voice still a monotone. "Fell off his horse, drunk. His brother Brant is the same kind of man. He came to the house. Said the debt was his now. Said I was part of the inheritance." She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, though the room was warm. "So I took the children and I ran. We've been running for months." Elias finally turned to look at her. Her face was illuminated by the firelight, her expression unguarded for the first time. He saw the exhaustion etched into the lines around her eyes, the deep, abiding weariness of a life lived on the run. "You're not running anymore, Lena," he said, the name feeling natural on his tongue. She looked up at him, and in her eyes, he saw a flicker of something he hadn't seen before. It wasn't fear, and it wasn't gratitude. It was a fragile, hesitant seedling of trust. The slow thaw was deepening, reaching the frozen ground of their shared solitude. The first snow came, a fine white dust that blanketed the world and muffled all sound. The ranch became an island in a sea of white. Life drew inward, confined to the house and the barn. The fragile peace they had built seemed to settle with the snow, becoming something more solid, more real. The children's laughter was a common sound now, echoing in the rafters. Elspeth and May had taken to calling him Mr. Elias, their voices bright and clear. One afternoon, as the winter sun cast long blue shadows across the snow, Elias was chopping wood, the rhythmic thud of the axe a steady heartbeat in the cold air. He saw Sam trudging toward him from the house, his small face serious. "Mr. Elias," the boy said, stopping a respectful distance away. "There's a rider coming." Elias stopped, the axe held loosely in his hand. He looked west, following the boy's gaze. A dark shape was moving against the stark white of the landscape. A man on a horse coming straight for the ranch. A cold knot formed in Elias's stomach. It was the feeling he'd had in the war, the premonition of violence. "Go inside, Sam," he said, his voice quiet. "Tell your mother to take the children to her room and to lock the door." Sam's eyes were wide, but he didn't question. He turned and ran back to the house, his small legs kicking up puffs of snow. Elias leaned the axe against the woodpile. He stood and waited, his hands hanging loose at his sides. He watched the rider grow larger, resolving from a dark speck into a man. He was big, bundled in a heavy buffalo coat, his horse a powerful black brute that ate up the ground. He rode with an arrogance that announced his intentions before he ever spoke a word. The rider pulled his horse to a stop a few yards from Elias, the animal snorting and stamping in the cold. The man looked down from his saddle, his eyes sweeping over Elias, the house, the barn. It was a look of assessment, of ownership. "I'm looking for a woman," the man said. His voice was thick and smug. "A runaway. Goes by the name of Lena. Got 4 whelps with her." Elias's face remained a stony mask. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just watched the man, his silence a wall. The man, Brant, dismounted. He was even larger on his feet, a bull of a man with a florid face and small, mean eyes. He hitched his trousers and swaggered closer. "I heard she came out this way. Heard a lonely old rancher took her in." "That you?" he sneered. "I'm her husband's brother, Brant. By rights, she and them kids, they belong to me. Come to collect my property." Property. The word hung in the frozen air, ugly and sharp. It was the same word Lena had used. It was the word Sam had whispered in his nightmare. "There's no one here by that name," Elias said, his voice low and flat as the horizon. Brant laughed, a short, barking sound. "Don't play games with me, old man. I know she's in there. I can smell the smoke from the chimney. That ain't your cooking." He took a step toward the house. "Now, you can step aside and let me take what's mine, or I can make this difficult." Elias didn't move. He simply shifted his weight slightly, planting his feet more firmly in the snow. He was not a big man, not like Brant. He was weathered and lean, built of sinew and bone, not flesh. but there was a quality to his stillness that was more formidable than any amount of bluster. It was the stillness of a deep-rooted tree that had withstood 100 storms. "You're on my land," Elias said, "and you're not welcome here. Turn your horse around and ride away." Brant's face purpled with rage. "You think you can stop me? You're just one man." He started forward, his hand dropping to the hilt of a large knife sheathed at his belt. The front door of the house creaked open. Lena stood there. She wasn't hiding behind the doorframe. She was standing on the threshold, her thin frame silhouetted against the warm light of the house. Her face was pale, but her eyes were blazing. In her hands, held like a weapon, was the heavy cast-iron skillet from the stove. Brant stopped, his mouth falling open in surprise. "There you are, you bitch. Get out here. We're leaving." Lena didn't move. Her gaze was locked on Brant, and there was no fear in it. Only a cold, hard fury that seemed to make her taller, stronger. Behind her, Sam appeared, standing just at her side. He was holding the splintered axe handle Elias had discarded earlier. He held it like a club, his small face a mask of fierce determination. Elias looked from the woman and her boy to the furious man in front of him. He felt a surge of something fierce and protective, a feeling he had thought long buried with his family. This was his land. This was his home. And these were his people. "I said," Elias's voice cut through the tension, hard as frozen iron, "you're not welcome here." He took a single, deliberate step forward, placing himself squarely between Brant and the porch. He was unarmed. His hands were empty, but his eyes held a promise of violence that was absolute. Brant hesitated. He looked from Elias's unyielding face to Lena's burning gaze, to the small boy with his makeshift weapon. He was a bully and a coward, a man who preyed on the weak and the frightened. He found none of that here. He found a wall of defiance, silent and unbreakable. He saw a family, forged not of blood but of shared hardship and quiet loyalty, and he had no power against it. He spat on the snow. "This ain't over," he snarled, but the threat was hollow. The fight had gone out of him. "I'll be back. With the law." "You do that," Elias said calmly. "You tell the sheriff how you came onto my land to claim a woman who fled from you. You tell him how she and her children were living in my barn because they were afraid for their lives. You tell him all of it." Brant's face fell. He knew, and Elias knew, that the law had little time for such matters, but the story would get out. The shame of it, the implication of his own brutishness, would stick to him. He backed away, his bravado crumbling. He clumsily mounted his horse, yanked on the reins, and galloped away, a dark, retreating figure against the vast, indifferent white. He did not look back. The silence he left behind was immense. It was the silence of a held breath finally released. The world seemed to hold still. The snow-covered prairie, the cold blue sky, the three figures standing in a silent tableau of victory. Elias slowly turned. He looked at Lena, still standing in the doorway, the heavy skillet now seeming to weigh her down. He looked at Sam, his knuckles white on the axe handle. He saw the twin girls peeking from behind their mother's skirt, their eyes wide. He walked up the 2 steps onto the porch. He gently took the skillet from Lena's hands. It was still warm. Her fingers were ice cold. He set the skillet down by the door. He looked into her eyes. "You didn't run," he said, his voice soft. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "Not anymore." That evening, the meal was different. The silence at the table was no longer a space between them, but a blanket that covered them all. It was warm and safe. After the children were asleep, Elias and Lena sat by the fire, as they often did. But tonight, he pulled a small wooden chair closer for her, instead of letting her sit on the rug. He watched the flames for a time, gathering his words like scattered kindling. "The man I was," he began, his voice low. "He died with Sarah and the children. I just kept walking around, breathing, but I was gone. This house was a tomb." He looked over at her. Her face was soft in the firelight. You and the children, you brought it back to life. You brought me back. He looked down at his own calloused hands, turning them over as if seeing them for the first time. I don't have much to offer. Just this land. This house. A lot of hard work and quiet days. He took a breath. But if you'll have it, if you'll stay, it's yours. All of you. Lena's eyes filled with tears, the first he had ever seen her shed. They were not tears of sorrow or fear, but of a profound, overwhelming relief. They traced paths through the exhaustion on her cheeks. We have no place else to go, she whispered. That's not what I'm asking, he said gently. I'm asking if you found a place to stay. She looked around the room, at the warm fire, at the sturdy walls that had protected her, at the man who had stood for her. She looked at him, and for the first time she smiled. It was a small, hesitant thing, but it was like the sun breaking through after a long storm. Yes, she said, her voice clear and strong. I think we have. The winter thawed, and the prairie came alive with the green blush of spring. The change on the ranch was just as profound. It was no longer a place of sorrow and echoes, but a place of life. The sound of children's feet running on the porch became the new music of the house. Lena's humming as she worked in her new garden was a constant, gentle melody. One day, Elias found her taking down the old, faded curtains in the front room, the ones Sarah had hung. She had washed them until they were clean and bright and was hanging them back up, letting the fresh spring air billow through them. It was not an act of replacement, but of renewal. The house was breathing again, its lungs full of light and air. He came to her, a small, newly carved bird in his hand, its wooden feathers smooth and perfect. He held it out to little Anna, who was sitting on a blanket at Lena's feet. The baby gurgled and reached for it with her chubby hands. Lena watched them, her heart full. She looked at this quiet, steady man who had offered them not just shelter, but sanctuary, who had stood against the darkness of her past and had not flinched, who had given her back her name and her strength. That evening, as the sun set in a blaze of blood orange and gold, they all sat on the porch together. Elias was in his rocking chair, the one that had been still for so long. Little Anna was asleep on his chest, her small head tucked under his chin. Lena sat beside him, the other children gathered around her feet, listening to the evening sounds of the prairie. The wind was soft, carrying the scent of new grass and damp earth. No one spoke. They didn't need to. The silence was a language they all understood. It was the language of home. This story, it ain't just about rescue. It's about how the most broken things can be mended, not with loud words or grand promises, but with the quiet, steady work of kindness. It's about how a home isn't just four walls and a roof, but a place where you can finally set down the heavy burden you've been carrying. We all build our families in different ways. Some are forged in blood, and some are forged in the fire of shared hardship. They're stitched together with the raw thread of quiet understanding, mended with small gestures of care. So here's your naming, for the quiet love, the unspoken promise, the steadfast presence that says, without a single word, you are safe here. Look around you. Look for the lonely places, inside yourself and in others. And if you're brave enough to offer a little warmth against the cold, you might just find that the sanctuary you build for someone else becomes your own. You might find that the quietest kindness is the one that echoes the loudest, the one that finally calls you home.